Good day, good people. In this video, I will build a tab control from scratch using AngularJS and TypeScript. So what is a tab control? A tab control is just a set of tabs, much like the tabs in your browser. If we go to the Bootstrap website, we can see what their default tab control style looks like. A tab control is what I like to consider an items control, meaning that we can use an array of data models to drive the number of tabs, their text, and whatever goes into the selected items tab content when you select one of them. Once we have completed the tab control, it will be available for use in any other component we like, and we'll be able to use any other components we create as the content for the selected tab item. We will be starting off with the .NET Core AngularJS template that I updated to the latest version of Bootstrap in another video. You can grab the code to follow along with this tutorial off my GitHub page, healermedia/AngularJS-tab control. You can find the link for that in the description for this video. Okay, now we'll open up our Angular app in Visual Studio Code by typing code dot. And I'll go ahead and run it by debug, start without debugging. Okay, so now that we're up and running, the first thing we're going to do is add another component to host our tab control. We will use the Angular CLI to create a component called data browsing. Since I am running this app from Visual Studio Code, I'm actually going to use Commander to type the commands to create new components. Within Visual Studio Code, we want to make sure our components get created underneath client app, source, app. So I'm going to come back over to Commander, cd into client app, cd into source, cd into app. I will then type ng g component data browsing, and that's going to go ahead and scaffold up a new component for us. Okay, so we can head back over to Visual Studio Code and see that our data browsing component has been created with a .html, .css, and .ts files, and it also registered our new component in app.module.ts. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is add a route for our new component. So we will add a data browser route in app.module.ts. Then we can come over to our nav menu component.html, select one of our other list items, whoops, copy, paste. We will use the data browser route, update the link, and change the name, data browser. Save it. And our app will refresh itself, and we can come to the data browser component, which right now is just an empty component. So just to verify that it's working, we'll come to data-browsing.component.html, add an h1, hello world. All right, there we go. Okay, now that that's done, we can come back over to Commander and use the Angular CLI to create our next component, which will be the tabs component. So I'll type ng g component tabs, and that will scaffold up the .ts, .html, and .css files for us. We can come back over to Visual Studio Code, verify that our tabs control is there, and then it was registered in app.module.ts. So there's our tabs control. Okay, now we can come back over to the Bootstrap website. We can right-click on these tabs to get some default HTML. Let's see, go ahead and grab this guy, edit as HTML, copy, come back over to our app, go to tabs component.html, and we will trim this up a little bit. Get rid of that. Remove these classes. Get rid of these list items. Actually, I'll leave those there for now. Save. We'll head back over to our tabs.component.ts file and grab the node name, app.tabs, -tabs. Come back over to databrowsing.html. Paste, close the tab, save and refresh. And there's our initial tab control. Right now it's just static HTML that doesn't do anything. Okay, so the architecture of this component will be as follows. We'll use a tab item.ts class that will represent our tab items, the actual tabs that you click on. We will use a tab pane item.ts class that will be the model for the content that our tab control will display when each tab is clicked, which will appear right here. We will use an @directive structural directive to help us inject new component instances into our selected tab item. Structural directives are responsible for HTML layout. They shape or reshape the DOM structure, typically by adding, removing, or manipulating elements. The tab control will be designed so that a hosting component can request an array of tab items and an array of tab pane items that it will pass into the tab control when it is created. So in this case, that will be our data browser component. The data that the data browser component will use will be got via a tab item service.ts and a tab panes.service.ts. We will inject these services into our data browsing component in its constructor. We'll modify our HTML in the tab control to use an ng4 to generate an item for each item in the array. And we will use two-way data binding to toggle the active class on the tab control. So I'll come back over to Commander and use the Angular CLI to scaffold up our services, our classes, and our directive. So for this, I actually need to be in the tab control directory. So cd tabs. Okay, so now I've used the Angular CLI to create our directive, our services, and our two data models for our tab control. I will come back over to Visual Studio Code and take a look at the app.module.ts. Now, our directive and our components got registered just fine, but we need to add our services. So I will import our tabs pane service and our tab item service. Update the path. And for our services, we need to go ahead and add those to the providers array. So we'll scroll down, add those two things to the providers array. And since we'll be generating components dynamically on the fly, the Angular compiler usually generates a component factory for any component referenced in a template. However, there are no selector references in the templates for dynamically loaded components since they load at runtime. So to ensure that the compiler will generate a factory, add dynamically loaded components to the ng module entry components array, which is right here. So to make this simple on us, we're actually just going to use the components that we already have, which we have a counter, a header, or a fetch data component, and a home component. So to demonstrate what this means, I'm just going to go ahead and add those here. Let's see. Counter component, fetch data component, and our home component. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is take a look at our tab item.ts class. Now this is the class that is going to represent each one of these tab items. So into it we will add a constructor. Get rid of the super call because it's not inheriting from anything. And we will add a public text, which is a string, and a public is selected, which is a Boolean. Save. So when we create an array of these tab items, the text is going to be the text that you see here, and the isActive flag is what's going to get toggled when you click on each of the tab items. So next we can come take a look at our tab pane item.ts class. This is the class that's going to encapsulate a reference to any type of other component, so that when we click one of these tabs, it's actually going to use this class to get the right component and inject it here in the tab pane content. So to do that, we will come to the TypeScript file, say import type from @Angular core. Then we can add a constructor, get rid of the super call, and just say public component type, and that's going to be any type. So the next thing we'll do is come take a look at our tab item service, and this service is going to have this injectable meta attribute added to it so that the framework knows that this is a class that can be injected via the constructor of another class. So first thing we want to do is import our tab item. So we can say import tab item from tab item. So this service is simply going to return an array of tab items. So it just needs to have a public function called get tab items. It's going to return an array tab item. Make sure that we get rid of that right squiggly. And then here we'll just say return new array and fill out some tab items. We'll call that one counter. We'll set its active flag to true. And then we'll fill in the rest. So a consumer of the service is simply going to call get tab items to return an array of tab items. And actually, I'm just going to leave it at 3 for now. Now we can come take a look at our tab pane service. Now what this is going to do is return an array of tab pane items, each of which is going to house a reference to some type of component. So in the tab pane service, we can go ahead and inject our counter component, our fetch data component, and our home component. We can import tab pane item tab pane item. And we're basically going to follow the same pattern here and just create a public function called get tab panes. That's going to be an array of tab pane item. And that is going to return a new array. And then here we'll say new tab pane item and just pass in a reference to a component. So counter component, tab pane or fetch data component, and home component. And again, this will be injected into another class via its constructor, and then it will call get tab pane items. Next, we can take a look at our tabs directive. And if you remember, I mentioned that a structural directive is responsible for manipulating an HTML layout. So this class will be used to find this app tabs ID in the DOM and append new components to it when we request them. So I'll just add a comment here that before you can add components, you have to define an anchor point to tell Angular where to insert components, which is what this is. Then into the constructor, we will add a public view container ref, which is of type view container ref. And this is going to be how the tabs directive injects the container reference to gain access to the view container of the element that will host our dynamically added components. Now, if you recall that I said we want to be able to pass in our arrays of tab items and our arrays of tab pane items into this app tabs component via its hosting component, which is the data browsing component.ts. So within this component, we need to import our two services and our models. So we can say import tab panes service tabs / tab pane service. We can import our tab item service. I'll just go ahead and add our imports for our models. So we'll add a comment that says services and models, and that's just going to be in the tabs directory. So the next thing we want to do is expose a public array of tab pane items. So we'll say public tab pane item, tab pane item. That's going to be an array. And we also need to expose a public array of tab items. So we'll say public tab items, tab item, array of tab items, I should say. Save it. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in a little bit here. Okay, so now that we have imported our tab pane service and our tab item service, we can, via the constructor, add private variables, one called tab panes service, which should be a tab panes service, and a private tab items service, tab item service. And that's all we need to do to access those guys from within ng on a net. So we can say this dot tab items equals this dot tab item service dot get tab items. And we could do the same for our tab pane items. So this dot tab pane items equals this dot tab panes service dot get tab panes. Save. Okay, so now that all that's wired up, we have access to this tab pane items array and this tab items array within our data browsing component.html. So to expose those two arrays to the app tabs control, we can come back to our data browsing.component.html and say tab pane items equals tab pane items and tab items equals tab items. So now when our app tabs control is instantiated, it will have access to these two guys which live in the hosting control, which is the data browsing component. Okay, so now we're ready to move over to our tabs.component.typescript file. The first thing we need to do is add some additional imports to this top statement here. So we're actually going to add host binding, which is going to allow me to add a set of CSS classes to the app tabs node in the DOM. We're going to add input, which we need to address input that comes in through a hosting containers array, which means that, well, the input, the @input decorator is how you access arrays that were added to a parent component. It's how you access these guys. We also need to add viewChild, component factory resolver, and I think that's it. We also need to import our tabs directive, our tab item, and our tab pane item models. So we'll say import tabs directive, tab pane item, and tab pane item. Next, we can add our host binding class. And this is just because when I reskinned the theme that came with the default Angular.NET Core, I need to add this class to the node of the components that we render there so the CSS cascades correctly down the page. All right, so the next thing we can do is add an input binding for the array of tab items that is passed into the tab control from the hosting control. So we can say @input tab items. That is going to be an array of tab item. All right, next we can add the array of child components, which is going to be our array of tab pane items. So @input tab pane items. So an array of tab pane item. Control KD. All right, so the next thing we can do is add our @viewChild tabs directive. And what that's going to do is it's going to allow us to access the node in the DOM where we want to inject new component instances. Okay, so into the constructor of this class, we need to add a private component factory resolver. And this guy is going to take the responsibility of instantiating component instances as we switch tab items into our tab control. Factory resolver. Okay, so now that we've set up this much, let's go back over to the browser and open up the developer tools and verify that we are populating our tab items array and our tab pane items. So we'll just set a breakpoint here, an ng on init, and refresh the page. So if we step over that, hover over it, we can see that we indeed have an array of 3 tab items, an array of 3 tab pane items, which each have a reference to the function that represents the component. Okay, so now we can just continue on through. Our tabs are still there. We can come back to Visual Studio Code, and now it's time to go edit the HTML in our tabs.component.html. And I actually grabbed the wrong HTML for this, so I'm going to come over back to the Bootstrap site and grab the version that just has a nav element and a div and a set of anchors. So we'll just copy that. Paste it here. I'll go ahead and remove these divs. Remove this ellipsis, bring that to the next line, get rid of these classes. So what we're going to do here is take this static HTML, which is now just 3 anchor tags. So I go ahead and save that, come back here and look again. This is just 3 tabs that's just plain static HTML at the moment. So what we're going to do is go ahead and remove these 2 guys. And we're going to add an ng4 binding. So we're going to say star ng4 equals let tab item of tab items. And what that's going to do is it's going to repeat this markup for each item in our tab items array. So right now this guy also has a class here of active. So we want to be able to toggle that programmatically. So to do that, we can add bracket class.active equals tab item dot is selected. Okay, so that's actually going to use 2-way data binding. So that means when we're going to write a function that toggles this value. So when you click on one tab item, the function will set is selected of the current tab item to false and set is selected of the newly selected tab item to true, and that will toggle this active class on our anchor element here. We also want to have our text rendered within each anchor, so we can come here to the end where it says home and replace that with open bracket, tab item dot text. Save. So if we did everything correctly, yep. So now we have our dynamically generated tab items based off the items in our array. So the next thing we can do is come back over to Visual Studio Code, go to our tabs.component.ts, and add the function that will intercept the selected item when we click on these tabs. So within Visual Studio Code, in our class, we can say public on tab clicked. And that's going to take a tab item of type tab item, and it will be a void returning function, which means it doesn't return a value. And we can say this dot set active tab item, which will take the tab item. Next, we will create our set active tab item function, so we can say public set active tab item as a parameter, tab item. This will also be a void returning function. And all we need to do here is iterate over the tab items using, we can say this.tabItems.for each, and into that we can pass a value, which is going to be the each tab item in the array, and that will be of type tab item. Can also pass in the index as it iterates over the array, which is just going to be a number. And we can use a fat arrow function, aka a lambda expression, to complete our function. So semicolon, control KD. And within this guy, all we need to do is say value.isSelected equals false. And that's going to unselect anything that is currently selected, which will toggle the CSS class. Next, we can say our new selected tab item .isSelected equals true. Save it. Come back over to our tabs component.html and attach the click handler to our anchor node. So to do that, you just say open parens click equals on tab clicked tab item, and that will pass in the currently selected tab items from our items control into our function. So we can hit save. Okay, so now we can come back over to our app and turn on the debugger, set a breakpoint in on tab clicked, and set active tab item, and select a tab. Okay, so that invoked our on tab clicked function and passed in the selected tab item, which is the fetch item. So that is now, we can now step into set active tab items. And as we step over that, you will see this CSS change. Okay, and the last thing we do is set tab item.isSelected equals true and play through. So now we have a nice tabbing effect. All right, so now that our tabs are working correctly, we need to go back to our tabs component.ts and add the code that is going to inject a new component as each item is selected. So we can come back over here, add a public load tab pane component. And that will take a selected index so that we can index into our tab panes array to find a new component. So index, that type is going to be a number. This also will be a void returning function. So the first thing we can do in here is say const tab pane item equals this.tab pane items. And we'll just use the selected index that was passed in to grab an item. Next, we need to get a reference to our component factory. So we can say const component factory equals this.component factory resolver .resolve component factory tab pane item .component. And that will create an instance of our component. The next thing we need to do is clear out anything that was there. So we can say const tab pane ref equals this.tab pane .view container ref tab pane ref .clear, and that will clear out the old component, and tab pane ref .create component factory will create and add our component to the tab control. So we'll go ahead and save that. Scroll down to our ng on a init function. So we actually want to run this when this component is instantiated for the first time. So to do that, when the page loads, we can say this.load component 0, which will take the first item in our tab pane items array, grab its component reference, create a component factory, get a pane ref, clear anything that may have been there, and then create the component and add it. So if you recall, back in our tabs directive, we created a selector called app tabs. So what we need to do before we test this code is come back over to the tabs control and add a ng-template app tabs so it knows how to select it. Close that up, and we'll add a comment. So the ng template element is a good choice for dynamic components because it doesn't render any additional output. So we can go ahead and save that. Okay, so we can save that, come on back over to our Angular app. The page has been refreshed and we've hit our breakpoint in our data browsing.component.ts and ng on init. So we'll go ahead and make sure we have breakpoint in our tabs components. So as this loads, we're going to go ahead and step into load component. Load component will get the tab item, the component factory, and the tab pane ref, clear anything that was there, and create a new instance of our selected component, which in this case is going to be our counter component, and it will add it to the first tab pane item. Actually, I need to go back and remove a class from our HTML. So this class is actually going to make that appear with display none, so I'll just remove that and save. And it will refresh itself. And this time we see our counter component. Okay, now we can see our counter component, so we need to come back over to VS Code, go to our tabs.component.typescript, and go ahead and call load tab component when the active tab item is changed. So we say this.load tab pane component, and we can say this.tab items.index of tab item, and that will vector us into the appropriate index in the array. So we can go ahead and save that, come back over to our app, it will refresh itself, and now we have a nice data-driven reusable component. Okay, let's go ahead and test this guy one more time by adding another tab to the end just by updating our arrays. So we can come back over to our tab pane service, and we'll just copy our counter component, stick it on the end there, come to our item service, make another counter on the end, save all, the page will refresh itself, and we can see now that we have a nice data-driven tab control. And if you see here, this looked like a bug for a second because both of these things got selected when I moved away and came back. But all that really needs to happen is this just needs to be set to false. So we'll save that. Now it's nice and smooth. So we can go to dashboard, counter, fetch data, and we can go to another component now that hosts a tab control, which can also inject other components on the fly. So wrapping up, there's a lot of different things you can do with it at this point, like calling the server to fetch the data that actually drives these tab controls. You could update the objects that represent these tabs to be components themselves and put maybe like a different icon in there or something. Okay, so that's that. Thank you for watching, and you can look in the description for this video and download this complete code off my GitHub page. Have a nice day.